Well, hello everyone. I have 2 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon. I am Chris Cain, CPWR's Executive Director, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar called Assess and Improve Your Pre-Task Planning Using CPWR's Checklist. Our presenter today, Dr. Babak Memarian, previously presented his project to improve JHA and pre-task planning in a webinar that was focused on electrical construction. Our host, Jessica Bunting, will drop a link to that webinar in the chat for anyone who missed it. Today's webinar will focus on the new checklist that can help contractors implement the best practices previously discussed. And now I'm going to hand it over to Babak, CPWR's Director of Exposure Control Technologies Research at CPWR, to tell us more about this new research. Thanks, Babak. It's all yours.
Thank you, Chris. Hello, everyone. I'm Babak, CPWR's Director of Exposure Control Technologies Research, and thanks for joining us today. Today, we will have a brief webinar, and we are trying to keep it short. First, I will provide a background about this project, what it is about, and what we have done so far. And then we'll discuss more the practical aspect of that and how we are going to use the checklist that we have recently developed and released. But before everything else, I would like to acknowledge my team at CPWR, Chris Lee and Sarah Brooks, both with CPWR, and they are also in this audience today. This presentation is part of our larger project, Prevention Through Augmented Pre-Task Planning at CPWR, which is funded by NIOSH through 2024. Our ultimate goal in this project is to help contractors and practitioners improve the quality of pre-task planning. But how? What we have done is, first, we try to identify gaps and shortcomings in current PTP practices and processes to see what's working, what's not working, challenges from practitioners' perspective initially. And then we try to explore effective strategies and solutions to see what contractors have used or what they recommend to use to fill the gap and improve the quality of the process. And at the end, we decided to develop an easy to use tool, a one-page checklist that helps practitioners assess their pre-task planning process and identify the areas that they need to improve. But why pre-task planning? So let's take a step back and look at the definitions and to see what PTP means in theory. We hear all the time that work-related injuries and incidents could be prevented or they are preventable if hazards were recognized proactively and unsafe conditions associated with the task, work processes, equipment, tools, and anything related to the task. And then employing effective controls to address these hazards. So in theory, it makes sense. But when and how we have to recognize these hazards and address them. In the construction industry, we have a process called pre-task planning, and we'll see that it is not only called pre-task planning, it is called many other things, but let's go with pre-task planning for this presentation. It's a process that should be performed before starting each task to identify hazards, describe different steps of the work, tools, materials, and also identify available controls. This process, as I said, it is also known as job hazard analysis, job safety analysis, activity hazard analysis, morning huddles, very inconsistent. And we will see how this inconsistency can impact the quality of the process. But before going to the next step and talking about our research findings, I would like to take a few seconds here and go over this code with everybody. And then I will leave the screen for the slide for a few seconds on the screen. So, and this code comes from a book, Atomic Habits. And this tries to encourage people to stop the process and think through and reflect and see whether what we are doing or what we have done many times in the past, whether it's working well. Have we ever questioned the process and see whether it needs any adjustment, any improvement? So I think this is a very nice code, and I think it is very much in line with what we are doing in this study. So I thought it would be interesting to use it in this presentation. So we wanted to stop and question, are current PTP practices functional? What is missing in the process? So the research findings suggest that incidents are preventable, but the burden is still huge, and we see a lot of work-related incidents and injuries and death in the construction industry. So to answer these questions from practitioners' perspective, we initially interviewed 28 construction managers and safety and health professionals representing different companies. And then we went to the job sites with Sarah and Chris. And we still do that. It's an ongoing effort, and we are trying to learn anytime that we go to the job sites to talk to workers and also managers. So we interviewed 93 construction workers, and we asked pretty much similar questions to see what they think about pre-task planning, what is missing, and how they would design it if they were in charge. We went to the job sites, we observed different pre-task planning sessions and morning huddles of different companies to kind of cross-examine the findings from interviews to see them in reality. We reviewed multiple samples of pre-task planning job hazard analysis documents to see the layout, design, the content variations, similarities. And I also should mention that to ensure our research findings are in line with the needs of industry and as far as quality, even application of our findings, we convened an industry advisory group with members from general contractors, specialty contractors, unions, and associations, and they provide feedback for every stage of our work. So we try to adjust our research findings our research approach to make sure that we are responding to industry needs. Here is the highlights of our findings from the very first stage of the work. Probably some of the folks in the audience have seen these or some of that, but as I said, this is an ongoing effort. We are adding to the list as we learn from different job sites, from different interviews we are conducting. I would say the most critical issue is a lack of comprehensive guidelines and standards in designing and implementing pre-task planning. And this lack of guidelines has resulted in a lot of inconsistencies. And it leaves a lot of room for contractors to design and implement pre-task planning in different ways. So, and because of that, we see a lot of inconsistencies in terms of style. We have seen various styles that contractors use to design and implement their PTP. And also inconsistency in terminologies. As I mentioned, some folks call it job hazard analysis, job safety analysis, activity hazard analysis. But how workers should deal with that? When they go from one job site to another, you can see how much confusion it can cause, or conflicts between trades on the job site, between crews, especially when we have multiple trades on the job site and everybody is doing their PTP different ways. So in some cases, it can result in missing some hazards, which falls between the trades, and nobody really responds to that. So this is a very major issue that should be addressed. And it was the main guide for this study. So we are trying to come up with some consistent guidelines to help everybody think about some good practices to design a more effective pre-task planning process for their projects. Also, PTP, JHA, these are mainly from compliance perspective. And some contractors try just to fulfill those requirements. But I want to mention the prevention through design initiative of NIOSH. In that initiative, the definition says that the focus is on workers, and workers are the one who deal with the product of the design or the task. So are we really asking workers about pre-task planning, about hazards, about challenges and difficulties they experience throughout the life cycle of the project? Typically, we don't see that. There is no or minimal room for workers' feedback. So with all of that, let's take a closer look to our findings. We try to categorize them, see the challenges and recommendations made by contractors. Some of these are recommendations, and some are real practices that they employ to improve the process. One critical step is designing the process and providing good content. Unfortunately, some of the documents, PTP documents that we see, they are long and wordy. They are not task specific. So as a result, workers may not spend enough time, or they may not pay enough attention when they are filling out or when they are going over the checklists or the information provided for pre-task planning. One recommendation is that replace text with some other visual aids like photos, videos. Some workers can connect better. They can learn faster and easier when we use photos and visual aids. And another thing is that we see task information or the information provided in pre-task plan documents do not really match with task requirements. Why? We all know that usually managers design and develop these documents, but whether they go to the job site on a regular basis, frequently, do they audit the job site to get better understanding of the current condition on the job site? Unfortunately, sometimes it doesn't happen. So we would like to encourage managers to go out to the job site, visit the job site on a regular basis, get workers involved to better understand the site conditions, to better understand challenges, mainly from workers' perspective. In our interviews, we also heard from workers that some folks said, hey, these PTP documents focus too much on safety and health. But we need information, we need supplemental information, additional information on tools, materials, even project schedule that we're working on. What other crews around us? We don't know that. So these are important pieces of information that should be also provided besides health and safety. Lack of buy-in, it's huge. Why workers do not realize the importance of pre-task plans? Pencil whipping, resistance to change. We hear that over and over. They say it is repetitive, it is redundant, it's useless. We don't want to do it. We have more important things to do. So they just want to just sign off and go to the work. And the flip side, we hear sometimes from crew managers or crew supervisors that they say, hey, today's task is the same as yesterday. Let's just sign off and go to work. It is not an accurate statement. Today's task cannot be and is not the same as yesterday. We all know that construction job sites are very dynamic and condition constantly changes. So no way that we say today's task is the same as yesterday. What if there's a new crew on a job site? What if the weather condition has changed? What if we have new members on our crew? So these are all important variables to consider, but it's a totally inaccurate statement. So we should stay away from that. It is a very ineffective routine just to say, okay, let's just sign up and go to work. Few seconds. No, that is not an answer. So PTP is not repetitive. It is not redundant. It is important to do it. One way is to personalize the process. How we can do that? So sometimes some contractors suggest that using some pictures or showing some real life incidents and near misses. So workers can better connect with that, better understand how incidents could impact their loved one's life if something bad happens to them on a job site. Also, we need to empower workers, get them directly involved in the process. when we talk to contractors, we ask, do you gather workers' feedback? They say, oh, yes. And we say, do you incorporate them in the process? And then it's the moment we feel that, no, not really. So workers should see that their feedback, their comments are incorporated. They are part of the deal. They should have that ownership feeling. We should give that to workers. So it is very important to constantly ask for their feedback and also incorporate the important ones. And the last one that I would like to discuss before going to the checklist is communication and coordination. One of the issues that we have noticed on the job site is mainly from workers' perspective that they say, hey, the crew leader or the crew supervisor, he or she doesn't know how to present, or poor presentation skills. And we ask contractors, do you train your crew members, your crew supervisors, how to conduct pre-task planning sessions? In most cases, unfortunately, the answer is no. So it is very important to make it a very systematic, or to do it in a very systematic way, so people and workers could see that consistency in the way they're conducting pre-task planning processes. Another issue is language barrier and lack of mentorship. So it is very important to consider that, because in construction, we have a pretty diverse workforce. So we should consider that, and we should find some solutions to help workers who may not be comfortable or who may not be fluent in English. So pairing with bilingual co-workers would be a good solution. And also they can provide some mentorship there. So I have listed some other challenges and recommendations on this slide as well. But the very last one is post-job review. It is a very, very important finding, and because pre-task planning is a good step to say how we need to do the work, what are these steps, here are the solutions, or here are the controls, here is the way to implement them. But at the end of the day, we should make sure whether all they worked or not. So that is the post-job review. So it provides the opportunity for continuous improvement. We can constantly check to see whether the controls we use all worked well. What was new to the job site? What did we miss in the morning when we had our PTP session that things changed throughout the shift? So these are very important things to do, post-job review or debrief. Few minutes. It doesn't need to be a long meeting. So it's always good to go, to circle back at the end of the work, at the end of the shift, and just go over work very casually to see what happened. So this is an ongoing effort, as I said. We are learning as we go to job sites, as we talk to workers, as we talk to managers. But how can we use these findings in practice? How can we translate these findings into an applied tool? So that was the next step of our research. So we decided to put these findings together and develop an easy to use one-page assessment checklist. This is the title of this checklist. And what is the function of that? The function of this checklist is it helps practitioners, crew supervisors, project managers to examine their own pre-task planning processes. And this checklist contains our research findings and also some practices recommended by industry experts. We developed that, and then we got it reviewed by 25 construction safety and health professionals in an iterative process. So we presented to them, we reviewed them one by one with our reviewers. They made their comments, we addressed them, and eventually we finalized and released the checklist. Currently, which is the very first version of this checklist, it is available in a fillable PDF format, so you can fill it out. You can click and on checkboxes and then print it, or if you're more comfortable using paper copy, so you can easily print it and use a paper copy. So we will have a walkthrough shortly. But I just want to mention that this checklist is not an exhaustive list of best practices. I am anti the term best practices, because when we say best practices, which means we are closing the windows and say this is the best and there is no room for improvement. But I would like to say these are some good practices and we are still trying to improve them. We are trying to find better practices, but this is the first version and we are trying to learn together and come up hopefully with some best practices later. So let's take a quick look at the checklist, have a quick walkthrough to see how we can use it, how or what questions there. And I believe you have a copy of the checklist to follow me on that. This is the one-pager checklist that I mentioned. We provided a brief introduction to say what pre-task planning is and how this checklist has been developed. And again, this is not a replacement for your pre-task planning. It is a tool to help you assess your pre-task planning. It is a tool to help you plan for a better pre-task planning or job hazard analysis. Feedback is very important for us, so we provided a QR code as you see on the screen, so you can use your phone, scan it, and you can provide your feedback. We are collecting all feedback, we consider them, and this is the first version, so we are trying to make improvements and release some advanced versions, hopefully in near future. Just to take a quick look at some of the questions that we have on this checklist to see how we should answer and how they help us. One important question that I would like to share with you guys is number 6. Does your PTP discuss ways to control each hazard? So if you say yes, we want to ask you whether you assign anybody to implement those controls, whether you follow up. That's good. We identified hazards. On our plan, we have controls, but who is responsible to implement that? Whether we follow up with them to see how the control was implemented, or if anything needs some adjustment, whether those adjustments were made or not. This is one of the questions that I really wanted to emphasize. Another one is number 9, and I also mentioned in my presentation today that whether workers have the opportunity to run the PTP session. And if yes, whether the contractors provide specific training, systematic training on how to conduct PTP sessions. So that is very important because we got that comment from workers. So poor presentation skills or inconsistency in presenting PTP documents and information. So this is very important. In one of our site visits that we had with one of our industry partners, MCD in Building Intelligence, they have a PTP process, they call it ORM, which comes from the Department of Navy, and they customize it. And one of the benefits of that process, which is based on whiteboarding, it is very interactive. It's one of the points that we emphasize a lot. Make the process interactive, get everybody involved. This process, the way they have designed it, it gives the opportunity to everybody on the crew to run the meeting once. So they provide training and they give this opportunity to workers also, not only crew supervisors, not only foremen, but also crew members to run the show. It is very important because it gives the feeling that they are part of the process, they own the process, and they have the voice. So this is a very, very critical step in implementing pre-task planning. Supplemental information was another important element that we learned from our research, from interviews that we had with workers. They ask for some information in addition just to health and safety. So here is the list of some supplemental items that contractors found helpful that should be included in pre-task planning in addition to health and safety. So this is another one to consider. And the last one that I emphasized before going over this checklist was post-job review, end-of-shift review. People use different terms, but let's call it end-of-shift or post-task review. This checklist is for pre-task planning, but what we wanted to close it and to put a nice closure at the end. Okay, so you designed, you conducted pre-task planning. What is for tomorrow? What didn't work well today? Do you conduct a post-task review? If not, we encourage you to consider that. It's a very important step that helps you develop a continuous improvement process for your pre-task planning on your projects that you conduct. So these are some examples and some sample questions that we have on the checklist. It is very short. It's easy to fill out. If you answer no to any of these questions, it is an indicator that you need to pay a little more attention to those areas. Maybe come up with some ideas to improve it or use some resources to improve it. We are working on putting together some useful resources and helpful information as like as samples, examples of, when we talk about post-job review, how to put post-job review together, what questions should we ask during that process, or some other questions that we have on the checklist. So that is the next step of the work. So that's why I emphasized feedback. It is very important for us. If you think something else should be added to the checklist, if you have any ideas for the next step, we would definitely like to learn from you, from our audience, to see what they think and what they recommend. With that, I would like just to show some of the testimonials we have received in just 1 month period since the time that we released the checklist. It's been received well by practitioners, and I would like to emphasize the third one. It says, it only took me a minute to fill out, but it made me think for hours about why we are not doing some of these things. It is exactly what we want from this checklist, and it is exactly what we want from this project: to change the culture, to change the approach, to stop and think about the process, think what we are doing and whether we can improve it and how we can improve it. And this is one of the tools that we have put together. And CPWR has several other very helpful, useful resources that you can go and download and use for your projects. And we are working on this checklist to make it more effective. At the end, I would like to acknowledge contributing companies and organizations who helped us through this process and this step of the project. Thank you all for your contribution. With that, I would like to conclude this brief webinar and open the stage for questions. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Babak. I don't know, are we able to put the checklist up on the screen
Yes.
or parts of it? There was a question specifically about question 6 that's come in. And for anybody who'd like to ask a question, you can pop it in the chat to me. This is Chris, or to everybody, or put it in the Q&A on the screen. So the question was, what if your answer to question 6 is yes? Do you go on to number 7? It says if your answer is no, then go to number 7. The person thought this wasn't quite clear.
So when they answer no, if they say, if they are not discussing the hazards or the way the hazards should be controlled, which means that, okay, there is no plan there. So obviously there is no person or no designated personnel to go after implementing hazards. So if they answer no to first part of question number 6, it means that hazard recognition or implementing hazards is an area that they need to think through. And that sub question comes after. But yes, if they answered no to the first part of question number 6, that hazard control part needs to be considered. Yeah, the whole thing.
Yeah, it makes sense to me that now that I'm looking at it, it's, 6A would not be applicable if you answered
Yeah.
no. So. Cool. There's some other questions coming in, and I do have some that were sent in during the registration process, so I'll go to those right now. one question was, what is the best way to track daily PTP completion?
Very good question. If the point of the question as completion is what they discussed in the morning, whether they were able to accomplish things throughout the shift, I think the best approach would be having a post-task review or end of shift review to go over things that they planned and to see whether they were able to successfully implement. If not, what challenges they had during the shift. And I think this would be the best or one of the good approaches if I understood the question correctly.
Okay. Another question is, what are your recommendations of PTP reevaluation frequencies during work? Other than mitigations, how else can PTP data be used by, say, the health and safety environmental folks?
Reevaluation, I believe, again, if I got the question correctly, so if we do PTP or we recommend doing PTP or JHA based on recommendations from industry experts, it should be done anytime the condition changes or the task requirement changes or anything changes related to the task or the work. Either the weather condition is changing, a major piece of equipment is coming to the job site, let's say a tower crane is being set up, or a new crew or some new trades are coming to the job site, or we are going to have some overhead work. So these are things that we need to constantly reevaluate and discuss even multiple times during the shift. Sometimes it's just once during the shift. Sometimes we may need to do that multiple times.
Okay, great. I'm just watching some of the questions that are coming in and they're very good. So, but I'm going to go back to the ones that were and pick out a couple more. One question that came in before with the registration process was, how does this apply to leading indicators?
Leading indicators, I believe this is, or these questions, or most of these questions are great examples of leading indicators because we are trying to think through the process beforehand, be proactive, see what we can do before going to before starting the task. So I would say these are great examples of leading indicators or approaches to address those. To complement this, or to help you better understand that or practice some, I would like to recommend visiting cpwr.com for a really great product that our colleague Dr. Linda Goldenhar put together, SCSMIS, Safety Climate Safety Management Information System that I had the pleasure of being a member of that team also. That is a great tool that you can also use to assess your safety climate, safety culture, and see some resources. But these two go hand in hand. This is a great example for leading indicators, and you can see more details and practices there too.
Great, thanks, Babak. Is there any hard data that shows the effectiveness of pre-task planning and/or JHAs?
As far as I know, in the literature, yes, there are some studies that they discuss or they have examined effectiveness of pre-task planning or job hazard analysis by Dr. John Gambitis at Oregon State University and other scholars who are working on this. There is some work, but not very extensively. So, but if I have access to any data, unfortunately, not at this point.
Okay. There's a couple of questions related to general contractors. One came in on the chat and one was asked beforehand. I'll ask you the one that was asked beforehand. It's, as a GC, JHAs are required from all of our trade partners. Would the use of a template specific to a particular trade be effective?
Very good question. My answer would be, if we are talking to some specialty contractors, as we also discussed today, it's very important to provide task-specific or trade-specific information. But if we limit the information to their immediate task or their trade, I think it is a little bit risky. So my recommendation is that PTP should have task specific or trade specific information plus a bigger picture of the project, because we need to know what's going on the job site at the same time. So you can provide, for instance, if you're working with electricians and or masonry crews, it's good to provide task specific information and PTP, and provide some bigger picture of the project. What's going on the job sites? What other trades on the job sites? We have it on this checklist also. What hazards might be posed by other crews working in your proximity? So I think it should be a combination of both. That would be maybe an ideal condition. Just to add to that answer, from one of the observations we had with one of the contractors, they used the term 720, which meant that besides the task you are performing, your immediate task, watch for your surrounding, overhead, above, and beneath to see what's going on, because it's construction job site. We cannot just be isolated or siloed and think about one task or one area. So this would be probably a case for you.
All right. There's another question related to a general contractor that came in the chat, and it reads, the issue with pre-task planning is that in my experience, it is a contractual requirement from the general contractor, and they require a specific form to be used that may or may not be the best. It's collected and nobody looks at it. Do you have any recommendations on how to improve that process?
Well, I'm sorry to hear that, because that is exactly what we see in the industry in our study inconsistency, or just from compliance perspective. Probably we should introduce them to this checklist and see the benefits of consistency and working through. But if GC has a standard practice, and if everybody else on the job site is required to follow, I think that is not a bad thing. But accessibility is important. That is the last question of this checklist also, that GC needs to provide a system. There are so many mobile applications, other platforms and methods to make information available after the session. So yes, I totally agree with you. That's not a great practice. When they finish the PTP, they go to the shelf and nobody going to touch it until something bad happens. So the recommendation is use some, first encourage them to come to a consistency in their method. And if everybody else can use their method on the job site, why not? But make information available using some platforms and tools. Unfortunately, I didn't have any better answer to this question.
I think that's a good answer, actually. And you had talked about this during your prepared remarks, but the question came in before you mentioned this part of it, and the question or statement, and then a question reads, one of the best things is to get crew members to lead the safety talk or PTP for the day rather than the supervisor. When it occurs, it is very worthwhile. However, it's difficult to get this participation. Do you have any suggestions to gain more participation?
Well, this process itself, when workers, yes, I agree that some workers, or some people, not necessarily workers, everybody, some people may not be comfortable speaking, or public speaking is nothing really easy for some people. But with training and with practices, if we give them enough training, if we show them how to do it, and then when they see that, and when they see that they're part of the process, that empowerment, involvement, and if you check Linda's product of SCSMIS, you see that it is one of the major elements there, worker involvement at all levels. So when they see that, so I think the first step is providing some good training, showing them, okay, how to do it. And little by little, we cannot expect them to change from 0 to 100. It's a continuous process. We should start, and we should give them this opportunity. and train them and see what happens. And when they see the result, when they see that it's working, they get encouraged to participate more. That is what we have seen with, in working with some contractors in that ORM process. Yes, some workers may find a safe corner and just wait to the end, leave at the end of the session. But this way, they have to participate. When they run the meeting, I think that gives them some sense of ownership. So,
And you mentioned that one of the contractors that you had interviewed and studied as part of the study had training in giving pre-task plan talks.
yes.
Do you know what was encompassed in that training?
So first, what topics they go over, how to interact with their peers when they make the presentation, the tone that they use to make the presentation, the setting of the room or the setting of the meeting. Sometimes we see that when we go to the job site, everybody's sitting at different spots. But these are small things that they try to tell them, topics, how to go after controls, what type questions they should ask, how to interact with their peers when they lead the session, and give the opportunity to people to respond to the questions. And this they training was more on how to make the session interactive. And then, yeah, sometimes people just talk in a very low tone, or they just go very fast or very slow. So the way they were trying to do that, they to come up with some standard. If I'm presenting today versus someone else tomorrow, so they should be as close as possible. It's almost impossible to make them very identical, but just get closer to some consistency.
Right. There is one question regarding if there was any kind of editable format for the checklist that you've produced. I'm not sure of the question of that, but Jess, could you put Babak's email in the chat so this person or anyone else who has a question can follow up with him offline about anything we might have that's editable. Another question's come in, is it possible to apply this checklist to safety procedures after disasters? Have you thought about that?
Well, I am not sure. I cannot answer that because I'm not an expert in that field, respond to disasters. So I don't know. I don't have very solid answer to that one.
Okay. Here's a question about time. What time do you believe we should allot for the duration of the PTP? We need to write this required time minimum spent into contracts, or they do not spend an adequate amount of time?
I think it is very subjective and it's really hard to say because it all depends on the size of the project and or the magnitude of the task they are performing and the size of the crew. There are so many variables to consider, and I don't want to say, okay, just do it 5 minutes, but maybe 5 minutes is not enough, or sometimes maybe 5 minutes is too much. So it all depends on, I think, the project, because for some contractors or for some crews that we go to the job site, a contractor has close to 200 workers on a job site, but a subcontractor has 5 people on a job site. They're performing much smaller work compared to that prime contractor. So it is really hard to put a number or quantify that. It all depends on the magnitude and the details.
Great. Another question that has come in through the chat says, you mentioned the MC Dean process, which I am familiar with and is great. Is there any research on the different types of pre-task planning processes available or being used, and have they been evaluated to see how effective they are? The supervisor on site is crucial and needs good training. Providing examples would help.
Well, as far as ORM, for instance, they have done case studies on the effectiveness of their process, or the Department of the Navy has conducted some study on effectiveness of the ORM process. But as far as other methods or other techniques that other contractors use, I am not sure whether, so there are case studies, there are multiple case studies in the literature that we can see, but if there is any comparative analysis and making comparison, let's say between 5 different methods, not that I'm aware of.
Okay, great. That's pretty much all that have come in through the chat. Here's another one that came in beforehand. What's the best place to have a pre-task planning meeting?
The best place, I would say somewhere quiet, not too noisy, that where you could communicate with your crew members and your co-workers well. You could hear each other. That's very important. And at the same time, it should be close to your work zone or where you work to see some work requirements. And also, yeah, it all depends on the season, the weather condition. If it is raining, if it is snowing, you can go indoor. But it all depends on many variables. But one thing is that, it should be quiet enough that you could communicate and hear each other. I remember from one of the job sites that we were observing a PTP or morning huddle meeting. It happened right beneath the tower crane. A tower crane was working overhead, and everybody was kind of distracted by that because they were just watching to see if anything was falling. So that was not an ideal condition because you should find a safe place to talk about safety. So quiet, but close to work. So this is what I can say.
Thanks, Babak. And we had there was another question in the chat and one on beforehand about templates for pre-task planning. I mean, this is a checklist that we're presenting to evaluate how you're doing it. But are there any templates out there that are widely available or recommended?
There are so many templates and checklists available, open sources online if you search, or I think on OSHA website, there should be something for JHA. But which one we recommend, I cannot recommend anything because I'm not in that position and I haven't seen, because as I said, there are so many of them. But what we are trying to do for the next step of this work, hopefully, is to put some good examples together of various examples of like PTP templates or documents, some good ones that we assess, evaluate with our industry advisory group and make them available as the next step of this checklist. This is what I can promise, hopefully, for the next step of this project. But on existing ones, I cannot recommend any of them or
Okay.
say it's good or bad, just.
All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and call that the last question. And thank you very much, Babak and Jess, for
Thank you.
hosting. And thanks everyone who tuned in today. I think we got a lot of information in a good amount of time. And as Jess said, she'll be sending out links to this webinar to everyone. Really appreciate you tuning in and hope you have a safe rest of the day.
Thank you.